All right, let's dive into our task. Today we're going to take up St. Justin Martyr, and a couple of things as we get started. One of them is, I think, the question that I'm really starting to ask myself, and I think as we're thinking about, it's likely going to come out in the notes somewhere, is what is the purpose of learning all these things? What are we in this for? And what are some lessons that we can draw from it? When I think of the time of the martyrs, for instance, and the time of these tensions with the Romans, you know, it's something that I think we have to consider, because sometimes I feel bad. It's like we're studying history and we're going over lots of information, but it could be like the information is over here and my life is over here, and they're sort of separate, and it might be interesting or fascinating, but my hope is to work at bringing them together. That's one of the reasons why, I'm taking the time to write about some of the stories of the saints. I think part of the answer to this is to connect with people at different times in different places than we are. Hopefully it helps some of their stories come a bit more alive. Like these men and women that we celebrate in the liturgy, they're real people, and they have a real story. St. Agnes today is a great example. She's a virgin and a martyr. She dies in the persecution of Diocletian. That's the last one. If you remember, we talked about the great persecution when he really goes after Christianity because of the tensions in the Roman state. We're going to see that. When we talk about the development of the Roman Empire, by the middle of the 3rd century, it's not very healthy, and there's a big plague that comes and all kinds of stuff that causes the breakdown in social cohesion. But I think the stories of the saints are one of the great treasures that we have. They're people who came before us. Sometimes we use their words to pray. Sometimes we use their concepts. We use the things that they worked through, and they're the people that we celebrate. So saints are one of the important groups. I think another reason why we are studying what we are is that history gives us a lot more perspective. Some of it is to learn from mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them, but history gives us a lot of perspective. It's easy to feel, for instance, like the world today is as bad off as it ever was, and things just keep getting worse, and the world is falling apart. And it's kind of funny that you can read Roman writers in the 2nd century who say the exact same thing. And I think sometimes that historical perspective can be helpful, because realistically, we live in one of the happiest, most prosperous times that there has ever been in history. And there's a big discord between what we feel and what I would argue is the reality. Now, certainly our world isn't perfect, and there's lots of stuff that needs work and renewal and attention. Some things need to be torn down, some things need to be built. That's certainly the case. But if you look at it from the perspective of history, things are actually really good right now. And the fact that we don't feel that way might not just be innocent. It's part of a story, it's part of eyeballs, it's part of our news cycle, and sadly, things like social media and the internet seem to have just exacerbated the problem, where they magnify all of this stuff that happens. So for instance, the people in California will tell you that the fires are, now worse than they've ever been before. And part of me wonders, well, how do you know? In the 500s, who was writing, stories of how many acres of forest burned in California? Or talking about the Santa Ana winds. We're going to cover a time period, for instance, in the 530s, where it's likely, we don't have direct evidence of it, but there's all this anecdotal evidence that it was a year that felt to most of the people living through it like the end of the world. And it was actually about a half a decade or more, because a volcano blew up in Indonesia. And it seemed to have been the largest eruption that we can extend out in history in either direction for several thousand years. And that eruption caused the northern hemisphere not to have a growing season for 2 years in a row. So rivers were frozen and snow was falling in France in July. And food production crashes and people start dying from famine and disease is happening. And there's all of these other consequences of it. You know, that was a pretty rough time. The fall of the Roman Empire in the West was a pretty rough time. And so I think there's some historical perspective that we get from just studying history. But I also think that there's lessons to draw out personally as well. Like the story of the martyrs, I mean, you know, their courage is pretty impressive. If you look at St. Agnes, I kind of marvel at her because, you know, I don't know, if I was 12 years old and someone was like, you know, cling to this idea of Jesus that you have or get married, and if you cling to the idea of Jesus that you have, we're going to kill you. I'm not sure that I'd be so ready to say, you know, I'm going to keep to that. That's a pretty impressive kind of faith. And sometimes you read the stories of the martyrs and it just puts your own life in such a perspective. It's like, man, I was struggling yesterday with laziness and these people are like staring down, you know, the Romans and they're being threatened with murder, and I'm like, well, maybe it's too cold to go outside and go to the church. And I thought that from our house. You know, like, it gives a different flavor to what we struggle with. It gives a different flavor and a different perspective to what we're after. And sometimes I think that's really helpful because, you know, one of the great principles of Christianity is that we're called into a community, we're called into communion. So being part of a church is part of the very essence of what it is, I would argue. It's not me and Jesus. How do we know that? Because you and I on our own do dumb things like that. You know, we need other people that push us toward virtue. We need other people that hold us accountable. We need other people that love on us when we're having a tough day and when we're weak. Like, we need other people in our lives. And one of the biggest tragedies that you can encounter with modern young people, which is really strange, is despite the fact that we live in the most connected world where communication is so easy, there's people that are lonely who say they don't have anyone. They don't have any friends. They don't have people that they go out and see. And they usually end up struggling with depression. I mean, those two go hand in hand. You find out very, very quickly that, you know, depression, thoughts of suicide, despair, all of that goes together very, very quickly. And I think this is important. Like in Christianity, there's this idea that faith is handed on from one person to another. You know, sometimes you hear a great speaker who's talking about some part of life or who's challenging you to take a step in the right direction, and there's something inside of you that says, yeah, I could do that, or yes, I should do that. Or you're visiting with friends and you realize that this thing in your life needs to change. Or that you want to be a better person. You hear people, there's a kind of, rivalry is probably a better word than jealousy, but you see people who are doing things that you'd like to be doing, whether it's prayer or the way that they are with their family or keeping a clean house or something, and you're like, I want to do that. Or I would like to be like that. You know, and that's part of what gives you the energy to do it. That's part of what gives you the strength to do it. So that piece of it, you know, we're called into communion. We're called to be part of a church because left on our own, none of us are very good at it. Left on our own, we're sort of easy picking. I think the best image of it is like the lonely tree that's standing in the middle of a field that hardly ever has leaves on it because the wind blows them all off. You know, in the spring when they're just budding. And none of us do all that well as a lonely tree. We do much better in a forest. And I think it's a good thing to remember. It's a good thing to just recall, because sometimes we have to fight against our own tendency. If you're not feeling well, if things are kind of down, if you're having struggles, it can feel like the last thing that you want to do is reach out and connect with other people. And your interior voice can tell you, well, it's too hard, you're not going to make it, it's too cold outside, it's too this, it's too that. And in a lot of cases, that interior voice is wrong. Like it's speaking baloney. You know, it's speaking from fear, it's speaking from anxiety. And yeah, there's challenges, but meeting with other people, it's amazing how often you can say, I enjoyed that so much more than I thought I would. You know, when you go to a concert or you come to pray for an hour of adoration, and beforehand you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to make it, what am I going to do? And pretty soon you sit there and your hour's over and you're like, man, I could do that again. That wasn't so bad. And that kind of thing, I think that's where we see like the importance of being called to communion. And all of that is true on the level of other people and the human family, but it's also meant to be true with us and the Lord, that we're called into communion with Him. So like I said, overall, I've just been pondering a lot of why we're studying what we do. And I hope I'm trying to emphasize some things that draw out some of that connection, but I think there's more of it that needs to be done. Into St. Justin Martyr, he's on the bottom of page 93. He was born in part of the modern-day West Bank. I think that's kind of neat to remember that there's lots of saints, there were lots of Christians in the Holy Land. The lack of Christians in the Holy Land today is a result of the Muslim conquest and the wars of the Crusades, and then the Ottoman oppression. And now, sadly, in modern Israel, some Jewish oppression. The Jewish state is not very friendly to Christians, sadly. They don't mind Christians coming for tourism and for paying money for things. But they don't really like that Christians live there, and they try to do things to oppress them. You know, that would be one of the other funny things that I would say, the difference between like fears and real experience. You know, if you watch the news today, you'd get the impression that the Israelis and the Palestinians are always fighting and it's always a mess and it's never good. And I remember the day that countered it most was we were in Israel and stopped at this glass workshop outside of Jericho where they had some special name for the glass. And then it was run by these Palestinians, and they were excited as peaches that we were there. I mean, you know, we're sort of taught in the United States, like, fear them, they're different, and all this stuff. They were some of the friendliest people that we encountered. And I don't think it was just because they had this shop and they wanted us to buy things. It was genuine. Like, they were just friendly people. And, you know, it was sort of like you got whiplash because, you know, sometimes you would have the impression, well, it's not really safe in the West Bank. And like, this was Jericho, and Jericho's in the Palestinian area. It's not in the modern day Jewish part of Israel. And, you know, there's parts of the Palestinian area that, yeah, were a little sketchy. You could tell when you were in them. They felt a little bit like Native American reservations. But by the shop, it was like, you get out, you walk around, you know, the people were friendly. They certainly weren't antagonistic toward us as Westerners who showed up in this giant tour bus. And that was very unexpected. That was very, very different than we are led to believe usually. And sometimes it makes you wonder how much of what we're told is narrative and how much is reality. Because certainly the reality on the ground was no one in our bus quite expected that. And there were funny things, like I think they have these famous dates, they're called medjool dates. And I was concerned, my dad loves dates, so I wanted to bring him back. These are sort of the best ones in the world kind of dates, whatever. And I wanted to bring them back, but I was concerned because sometimes customs freaks out if you have food in your luggage. And these Palestinians were hilarious because they're like, why would you do that? I was trying to ask them if I could buy some and have them ship them to the United States. Because if you ship it by cargo, then you don't face all those challenges. And they're like, why? You're a stupid white man. Just put it in your bag. You'll be fine. And it turned out that dates, because they're dried or whatever, they're not the kind of thing that causes too much problems. But it was just sort of funny, like, again, that was kind of cultural whiplash. It was not what I expected. So Justin Martyr is from the modern day West Bank, and he's probably one of the most important early writers of Christianity because he decides to break what we call the discipline of the secret. So early Christians kind of kept to themselves. They didn't share a lot of their rituals and a lot of their teaching outside of the Christian community. And what that meant is a lot of it wasn't written down. Justin Martyr is one of the first authors who decided to give like a full explanation of the Mass. So he writes, his most famous works are called the Apologists, and he writes them to the emperor. And he says, basically, this is what the Christians do. We gather together, we pray, we believe that Jesus is God, we consecrate the Eucharist, like those kind of things. He's the first one that we have who decides to cross that boundary. So he's known as a Christian apologist. In this case, apology means defense. It's not like apology, I'm sorry. An apologist is a defense, someone who offers a reasoned explanation for why you do what you do. This is where, if you've heard of apologetics before, apologetics takes its name from this same kind of root and understanding of apology. Not that we're apologizing for something wrong, but that we are giving a defense for what we believe. He is a convert to Christianity later in his life. So he's one of these great examples where he lives in this pagan and stoic world. And paganism and stoicism, he's like, yeah, this ain't working for me. Stoicism was sort of like, be virtuous because it's better to be virtuous than not to be virtuous. But it doesn't really make a difference because life doesn't really matter. But be virtuous anyway. And that is a philosophical system. Do you think that would work very well for you? As a modern young millennial, I'd be like, no. Why? That doesn't... Like, if there's no real contact with a person, if it's not some kind of relationship, if there's not meat to it, if it's do this because it's the right thing to do, like, well, shoot, that doesn't work very well. And so he is one who's inspired by the example of the martyrs. This happened a lot. This is one of the ways that Christianity really began to spread, is this time of persecution is increasing. And if you're in the pagan world or the Stoic world, and they say, hey, worship this God or we'll cut off your head, like, that's not even a debate. You just worship the God, because if you're a Stoic, it doesn't matter because they're not real anyway. And if you're a pagan, it's like, well, they have their gods, I have my gods, who knows? You just add one to the list. It's not a big deal. And so for the Christians and the Romans, as this persecution is happening, the Romans sort of look at them like they're from Mars. I mean, they're just completely like, what are you doing? You're idiots. Like, if you're Stoic, it doesn't matter. If you're pagan, you just have an extra god, and there's lots of extra gods, so that shouldn't bother you. Why are you guys so weird? You say no, absolutely no. No to the point of death. And that was a puzzle piece that the Romans couldn't fit into their world. it's like trying to pound a square peg through a round hole. It doesn't work. It doesn't fit into the Roman world because the Roman religious system doesn't have a place where that kind of belief makes sense. That kind of belief sounds illogical. And that kind of thing, I think, is so important when you see something that sort of breaks or shatters a world. So as Christians do this, when belief actually means something, when it's like, no, I will stake my life on this, you have to take a step back and ask, why? Hopefully you wouldn't do that if someone told you, like if the police came to your door and said you had to paint your house a different color. Is that a hill you would die on? I mean, even if they picked a really bad color, you'd probably do it just because it's like, well, do I get arrested or do I paint it like lime green? I don't want to live in a lime green house, but is it worth getting arrested over? Our answer would most likely be no. And so I think you have to ask, what is worth getting arrested over? What is worth breaking the law? Because in this case, it was illegal to be Christian. And they did it anyway. So you see, there's something about that that's really, really fascinating. So these early Christians, as they cling to their belief, that fascinates Justin Martyr. He ultimately becomes a martyr. That's where his name comes from. So he writes this apology to the emperor, and he kind of exposes what Christians do. He wants to give the emperor a reasoned defense of Christianity. Christians are not immoral. The pagans accuse Christians of being immoral, which is sort of funny because to us, it's like you have that backwards. Christians are holding to a high standard of morality. You're holding to basically nothing. It's the pagans that are immoral. But in this world, that's actually one of the things that they accuse the Christians, that Christians are inherently immoral. You're immoral. You're corrupting the virtue of Roman life. Why are you corrupting the virtue of Roman life? Well, like I said, diving down some of these rabbit holes, I think, is part of what makes history come a bit more alive. He talks about the seeds of Christianity. So this is another thing that Catholicism really emphasizes, and we could trace it all the way back to people like St. Justin Martyr. You can kind of trace it back into St. Paul, who uses a few pagan sources. He quotes a few plays in his letters at different times. And that causes, consternation for some people because they're like, well, Scripture must be absolutely true. And so if Paul uses these plays, if he uses this phrase that's from a Greek tragedy, what does it say about the Greek tragedy? Is it good? Remember that many of them have significant immoral parts that would make it so as a Christian, you wouldn't watch them. But St. Paul uses some of that in his letters. So Justin Martyr works on the same principle, that there are seeds of the gospel, there are good things, there are truths that are found in other places, and they're meant to prepare the way for Jesus. It's like God has planted seeds all over the world, and seeds grow when you water them and they get exposed to air and light and heat. And so you can take ideas, the principle is that you can take ideas from Greek philosophy and you can take ideas from the Jewish world and you can use things, for instance, from Hinduism and from Buddhism and other places because they're true. And just because you're using them doesn't mean you're accepting that whole religious system, but it also means that sometimes the religious system isn't completely wrong. So a great example of this, for instance, in North Dakota is also a bit tragic. Many of the Native Americans in our area had the idea that there was a great spirit. They had one God, and they actually held to a fairly Christian standard of morality. You can work out whether that was from earlier contact with Christians and how it spreads through the Native American stuff and different things. But arguably, the Native American religion especially practiced by certain tribes, was fairly close to Christianity. You could almost blend them together and rename a few things and give it a little bit of spit polish and stuff, and you'd have something that would feel very familiar to us as Christians. And the early missionaries kind of had this debate, and sadly they settled the debate in a different direction. So they demonized the whole early system, and this is why you have Devil's Lake. And you have lots of these names, is they took these Native American beliefs and they said, no, they're wrong, they're pagan, they're completely divorced from Christianity, you can't follow that anymore. And so there was this kind of cultural annihilation that was practiced by groups like the Benedictines that established the mission at St. Michael's, south of Devil's Lake, now on Spirit Lake Reservation. And, it's not to say that the early missionaries were completely wrong. They may have understood things better than we do today. But it is a little bit tragic that for a belief system that was fairly close to Christianity, they didn't just try and push it closer to Christianity. They tried to separate it and say, no, that old one must be left behind. And it didn't work very well. There's a lot of cultural resentment. There's a lot of problems that happened with that. Justin Martyr and some of the examples of Christianity would say it may have been better to look at these things as a preparation for Christianity and to explain them in a sense that tries to emphasize the continuity and the truth of Christianity. Not that you're compromising on what Christianity is, but to see it sort of as an evolution of these Native American beliefs instead of drawing a line in the sand saying this is all bad and we need to start over. So this is a kind of principle that the early Christians will adopt very, very readily. You can take things from paganism, you can take things from science, you can take things from all these other places as long as they're true, because there's not a contradiction in truth. That becomes very, very important. Lots of the early Protestant reformers fundamentally reject this proposition, which is why in modern day Protestantism, you very rarely find much in the way of philosophy. How the world works, epistemology, how you understand things. They don't, Protestantism kind of rejected this principle that you can't use philosophical things to describe Scripture. You can only use Scripture alone. You start to hear that banner and that refrain, and I would say you start to see where it's like you fall off the cliff because you start rejecting all kinds of things that in and of themselves aren't bad. The speed of light is the speed of light. Whether you learn that because you shot a laser at something or you learn that because the Bible told you, it's still the same thing. So he gives some of the first major explanations of the Christian liturgy and sacraments. Before him, it's often kept secret, like I said. So we owe a debt of gratitude to St. Justin Martyr because he's like, well, this is what we do. The Romans, if you read Roman sources, they would write about Christians that they were cannibals that would get together and eat children. And, they had all of these weird, immoral beliefs, and they practiced secret rituals. And, they just had on and on and on and on. And it's sort of like, you feel a little bit like you're at the end of the telephone chain in junior high where something started. And, in the beginning, it was Susie went to Sharon's house, and in the end, it was Susie killed Sharon. It changes just a little bit each time, but just a little bit means there's a fun game, if you've ever heard of it, called Telestrations that works on that principle. It's a fun game, and it's easy to play, but you start with one thing, and then you hand your sheet to a person next to you, and they have to draw a picture of what you wrote. And then the next person has to write a sentence from your picture, and then draw a picture of what they wrote. And very often, things go haywire. Especially if you do something that's kind of ambiguous and hard to understand in the beginning. You know, like an elephant celebrating a birthday. That will end up in a strange spot. Irenaeus of Lyon. So he is 125 to 202. He's a disciple of St. Polycarp and lived in Smyrna, so modern day Syria. He's from the area way in the east, and he's called Irenaeus of Lyon, and Lyon is in France. So he ends up in France. I think that he is one of the most important people in this sense for early Christianity. Lots of us would believe the Enlightenment idea that people generally stayed where they were born and they didn't move around that much. And there's some truth to that in a lot of cases. But we discount the fact that people actually moved back then, sometimes as much as they move now. He's from Syria and he ends up in Lyon, southern France. That's thousands of miles. That's many, many months, if not years of a journey. And I don't know if we know his whole trajectory and how he leaves Syria and ends up in France. I don't know if he sails all the way by boat, if he stops in Italy for a while, or what. But I think he's a great example of the discourse that was happening between Christians in different places in the empire. Remember, the Roman army kept the boundaries of the empire and the fights sort of on the outside, so the inside you could trade with each other and talk. This is a little bit like the United States, that we have international borders, and within the United States you can move around freely. You don't have to get permission or need a passport to go to South Dakota, for instance. You could get in your car and drive there this afternoon and experience the great warmth of South Dakota. It's probably only like 10 below. I mean, that's a huge increase from what we have. So I think he shows us that Christianity and Christians were moving around. That people, some people especially, they did. They moved from Syria to Italy, or they moved from Italy to Egypt, or they moved, from Egypt to North Africa. And that's an important idea to counter, because our good old Enlightenment friends who tried to burn down the world decided that before the Enlightenment, they call it the Enlightenment, was the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages, where people believed foolish things and myths, and they did dumb things. Sometimes they did. In medicine, you're just left scratching your head for about 1,000 years. But there's lots of things that are actually from these Dark Ages, and they weren't nearly so dark, and usually until the Vikings came along. The Vikings were not very nice. Maybe that's why the football team struggles. They have the wrong mascot. They should pick a nicer mascot, and then they could be nicer people. So he's a disciple of St. Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of John. Irenaeus is in this third generation of believers. And he wrote a famous work called Against the Heresies, which gives a sort of systematic explanation. So heresy means someone who professes